Welcome everybody to a new episode of Data Minds. I'm Chris Peters, the CEO of Data Minded, and today I'm joined by Seb Deletaille.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, nice to meet you. And he's gonna tell his entire story, right? I won't do any introduction. I'll let him do the introduction. Can you maybe in 5 minutes describe who you are and what's your story?
Sure. So I'm a tech entrepreneur, and I had the pleasure of creating one of Belgium's big scale-ups called Reactor. We work in the space of big data applied to the telecom industry. Just before I talk about Reactor, like my background in 2 seconds is I'm a business engineer by background, so studied at Solvay in Brussels. That's really the place where I found a taste to mix like business studies with tech, maths, physics. I was a physics assistant at university. From Solvay, I started my career at McKinsey. That's basically a point of my life that I really loved, met amazing people, learned amazing skills, particularly how to speak with CEOs. So my communication skills were really refined during my time at
making
McKinsey.
slides, I guess.
Making slides and Excel models. I'm an Excel black belt, man. Be careful for my Jedi. But the thing that was fun with, let's say, that background is the bridge between tech and business is a very rich bridge. And it's really, I'm always convinced that when you create that connection, that's when you create the most amazing things. Whether it's business value, whether it's social value, it's there that it happens. And so in my background, you'll always see that those two components have been very mixed. When I decided to leave McKinsey just after being promoted, it was really because I felt that that company was great, that there are lots of people that are going to have a great time being consultants, that I was really an entrepreneur by DNA, and so wanted to create companies, make them grow. That's what excites me. Actually, when with my co-founder and best friend Loic Jacobs, when we created Reactor, we created 3 companies, and Reactor at the time, called Real Impact Analytics, was just one of those 3.
I never knew that. Did you create 3 companies?
We created 3 companies. Look, it's the best way to fish, right? You put several rods and then you see what bites. And in one of the rods basically went bankrupt. The other one we never sold. So the sales cycles were very, very, very long. And so we had a good product, we had a good offering. There was interest, but we never sold. So that's kind of a good way to give up right away. And Real Impact, what was interesting was, I said, okay, well, there's this new trend. At the time, it was business intelligence. That was the buzzword at the time, BI. And so I would go to different companies within Belgium, and they say, okay, well, look, we're 25, we're excited. Would like to be part of this BI trend. Would you like to work with us? And companies like Telenet or companies like Proximus, Belgacom at the time, looked at us and said, you know what, Tiger, why don't you go do this with someone else and then come back? And that's precisely what we did. We went to Africa. We contacted one of my old clients at McKinsey, who said, okay, well, look, we'd love to work with you. We have these big problems around geo-marketing. We have no idea of what's our performance in this area versus that area. We don't know where to attack, where to defend. A very basic business need, but for which they had no data whatsoever. And when we arrived in Côte d'Ivoire, what we set up was a very simple pivot table in Excel. So not rocket science, not advanced analytics, not big data frameworks, just a pivot table where you had KPIs per town. And based on that very simple Excel model that we would deploy in 2 weeks with training, and that we would invoice for 20,000 euros, we really had the genesis of a minimum viable product. And that was a very fortunate start, a very lucky start, because neither Loic nor I had any idea that what we had in our hands would turn into one of Belgium's big scale-ups. And what we had in our hands with that Excel model was quickly going to turn and grow into first custom IT, then app development, and then how to make the big data frameworks work within this product management framework.
Absolutely. So when you were still doing Excel, it was just you and Loic like on a plane to Côte d'Ivoire and like copying, pasting the data together yourself and trying to come up with answers? How did
exactly.
Work?
And so in the beginning it was Côte d'Ivoire. We were there around the civil war where Laurent Gbagbo got ousted by the military, and then there were elections. After that, we ended up in Liberia, where the shareholder of the telecom operator was one of Charles Taylor's best friends. So Charles Taylor is the guy who's in charge of the genocide in Liberia. We ended up in Guinea-Bissau during a military coup that they did on April Fool's Day. So go call journalists, ambassadors or your family on April Fool's Day to say that there's a military coup in Guinea-Bissau. Everyone laughs at you.
Yeah.
But so that whole period, the beginning of Real Impact, was as roots as you can imagine. We didn't have a garage, but we had a shady airport lounge in every African capital that you can name. We were absolutely crazy. We'd go into places that no one would go to. We applied for the Excel model was called the war room. It was in the war room that you'd see the KPIs of every town. And so we went and deployed the war room in Sudan. The problem is that when you apply for a visa to Sudan to say, well, what are you going to do in Sudan? We're going to implement a war room. You get arrested. We had the same joke in Afghanistan. And so we went to all these crazy places. And I think it's one of the reasons why Real Impact really kicked off. It's because we were young and crazy. We were not afraid of going into countries that no one wanted to go to. And you actually realize that that's one of the reasons why we were able to grow so fast. It's because our competitors, who are generally very big IT and consulting companies, it would happen often that we'd be in competition with Microsoft Africa, with IBM, and these companies didn't want to have business in Afghanistan. They'd go there if they were really obliged by one of their big international clients, but the actual local companies, they said, those guys, they're not interested in our business. You guys from Belgium, you don't mind coming here, you're fun, you deliver extremely professional work, and you do the follow-up of your work all time long. And that's how we managed to create relationships with clients that are still there today, 9 years afterwards. Yeah.
So your strategy was on purpose, as like the Proximus and Telenet said, no, like I need to go to Africa, to the countries that are a bit underserved at the moment, but then having the risk, or let's say risk of working in rough areas, I would guess, right?
So there's a real difference between what was imagined, what was the strategy, and ex ante before you launched, and then what you saw. When I look back, this is actually what happened. In reality, there was no strategic plan. We were basically going where the clients were telling us to go. But that's the whole thing with a product market fit, is that if at some point you see that there's a boom in the demand, it's basically because you're doing something particularly right that others have not addressed. Either because they don't know about the opportunity or because they've decided not to pursue it. And it's true that for us who had fresh from university, we had our first job, the idea of selling an Excel model for 20,000 euros for 2 weeks of work. I mean, I remember at the time saying, oh, that's nearly half of my yearly salary just in 2 weeks work. And what I didn't realize is that for a corporate, I could have said 50K, that he would have bought it anyway, because that level of budget is so small that there was really nothing. I mean, the CEO could have had budget authority on that amount by himself. He didn't need anyone else's approval. He could just sign the paper and that was it. And those dynamics, we were lucky because we did something right from the start. And so directly there was traction. With hindsight, because when you have a few years of doing this and then you look backwards, indeed, going to emerging markets was one of our best moves, because if we had been yet another player, not just Belgium, but in Europe, yet another player in the US, we would have been in a very, very big pool filled with fish.
Yeah.
And the odds that we would have been eaten up would have been pretty high.
Sure.
Going to emerging markets meant that we had close to no competition. We had access to all of the data in the world. We're going to talk about data in a minute, but regulation is lower in Africa. And because the overall skill level is different than the skill level you have in Europe or in the US, we basically had clients that were very keen to give us access to everything and say, can you find something interesting in all of this data? And that allowed us to learn the telecom field much better and much deeper than what actual European or American telcos knew themselves about their own data.
Yeah.
And that was the real critical smart move. It paid off. Thanks to that, we were able to become a significant player in the telecom big data space, to have references, client references, but also use cases that were really, really top-notch, amongst the best in the market. And it's from that experience that we were able to pivot towards a product company and say, okay, well now let's develop apps. Let's develop apps on all of this know-how that we've accumulated during several years.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I can definitely relate that if you don't have any client yet, finding your first client was for us also like the most difficult thing. Like there was a lot of doors just were closed all the time, no matter what you did. But then the moment you have a track record, then I think you de-risk it a lot from the client's perspective, because they say, okay, they have done it a few times already, so they must be doing something well, otherwise they wouldn't be here anymore, right? So I can definitely relate to that. Maybe what I would also be curious to know is, so you started with you and Loic on an airplane in a lounge. At some point, Real Impact Analytics or Reactor turned into a company of 150 people or 130 people or something. Can you share a bit about the growth? How did you hire the first employee, the first person, and how did you manage to scale that up quite big? Because indeed, I don't know a lot of Belgian companies who went from 0 to more than 100 employees in a couple of years in the end, right?
Yeah. So I clearly think that Reactor is one of those 10 examples of the latest wave, because if you go really back, you can say Skynet, was a big one, and so there are other companies that reached, critical sizes. But if you look at the recent younger tech entrepreneurs, clearly companies that have gone over 100 employees, they're about 10, and there's some amazing companies, Colibra, Showpad, Team Leader, Odoo. These are all companies that have still an incredible potential to continue to grow, but who went through those type of growth cycles. On our side, typically, I separate a few phases. There was a first phase that was really the starter phase. That was when we were between 0 and 10 people. I actually call that the founding team phase, as opposed to founders, which were just 2 people. We actually needed 10 people for this adventure to become what it became. And so in that beginning, the founding team, how we attracted them was word of mouth. It was looking at who were your friends, people that you knew were smart from university. And in the beginning, we had more business engineers. Then we convinced engineers. Then we basically had that one friend that had done a PhD in applied maths, Gauthier Krings. And then basically with all of those different people, we said, well, you know what? These 10, we have enough brains to make something exciting here. You sure did, absolutely. And that's one of the things one of the advice that we followed from Netflix, which was always attract the best people, because they will in turn attract even better people. Yeah. It really depends on what division you want to play in football. But there's no point in attracting a B player, because the only effect it's going to have is scare away the A players. And so that was a really strict criteria, which was we always wanted to recruit people that were smarter than the founders. And we were able to create that first set of people. And in that phase, it was pretty fun. Everything needed to be created. And what's difficult at that time is that you go through the normal crises of a young company. For example, the first time that you need to have a decision-making process, there's a crisis. The first time you need a vacation planner, there's a crisis. The first time you actually need to fire someone, there's a crisis. The first time we pay different salaries, not everyone gets paid the same. That creates a crisis. And so that's the typical first phase, where you see if the sauce takes well, you see if the people get along, you see if the clients like what we produce, and you go through these crises. Generally, most people do, because they're documented, they're not very difficult, they're small crises. Then you go into the second phase, where you're between 10 to 30 people, and there it's a very different ballgame. De facto, you have dynamics around delegation, around teams forming, around culture, around values. And so that phase is a different phase. It's a bit more complicated than the first one. It's followed by another phase where you're between 30 and let's say 60 people. And then the final phase is when you're above 60 and you go towards the hundreds, the changes are less critical. It's kind of same as before, but just continue to scale the process as you would. You need more computation power if you had a larger data set. Once you've got your cluster set up, it doesn't really matter if you have 50 more employees, 100 more employees, etc. Across those different phases, you see, so the starter one, the 30 to 60, the 60 to plus. What was amazing was we were doubling in size roughly every year.
Yeah.
That meant that every year you had half of your employees that were in the company for less than 1 year.
Yeah.
And that creates a whole set of challenges, particularly around values and culture, because that means that every year you have people that come with their own background, with their own preferences, and that shape your company. Because they absorb how you work, they absorb how you think, but they also shape, they also contribute. Things change. And that's one of the very difficult things to do as your demand is doubling or tripling every year. And as basically everything in your company needs to be set up at the same time.
Because that's also a possibility, right? If you're doubling in size every year and you see you're struggling a bit, just you can decide to slow down, right? Or was that never an option for you guys?
So it's a very essential question, which is how ambitious do you want to be, and what type of growth do you desire, and are you able to tackle? And clearly, we had kind of the basis for us was we're excited by high growth. We're excited by creating a very big company. Let's get over that Belgian trait, which is small is beautiful. Yes, small is beautiful, but having international companies is also beautiful. And I'm super proud to be here in Leuven, where basically we have the biggest brewer in the world. But that is not a random, or it's not ugly because it's big. No, it's terrific. And so in Belgium, we sometimes are a bit shy or modest about being ambitious. And so clearly we said, let's be one example of one company that wants to be ambitious. So growth was always the high priority. We were able to generate growth with our client base. And so then the next question was, how much growth are we able to deliver? And at the biggest growth cycle was when we passed from something like 40 employees to 100. That was our biggest and the steepest curve. At that time, it was one of the most tense periods of everyone's life at Reactor, because that's when we were working on average at 140% utilization. So there was double staffing, there were double projects. There was always too much work, always. And actually that was probably one of the best periods in terms of productivity, because we all knew that there was not enough manpower to do everything that needed to be done in a day. And so the trade-offs we were making were incredibly efficient. They were always versus how am I going to get as much shit done today as possible. But you see, this whole dimension about growth is if we had slowed it down, I'm not sure that it would have necessarily been beneficial. You know, like there is a benefit in being in a dynamic where everything grows, because it creates momentum, it creates common objectives, it creates common priorities, and then it gives you a sense of we're all in the trenches together.
Yes.
You know, like, and that's very important to create bonds.
I remember the first time I met, back then was Real Impact Analytics. I'm not sure if I met you, but I had a meeting with Simon in the old Flagey building where you were. And it was like the last week before you moved out to the new bin to Tour Bastion. And it was such a beehive. I should have filmed it. Like you saw like engineers almost crawling over on top of each other to get work done. You had like a foosball table there with like 3 engineers standing next to it, hacking code. Like indeed, there was a special atmosphere that you can't just create if you walk into any normal company, right? You could see there was something was moving there. It was pretty cool to see.
And you know, the thing that was like for me amazing at the time is we had no idea of what it meant to pivot from a service company to a product company. We kind of said that because we thought it was cool. We said that because everyone would say that in the industry. And we said to ourselves, oh, let's be very financially intelligent. You know, like product companies have higher valuations than service companies.
Which is true, right?
So we could have a multiple of 20 on our recurring revenue.
Yeah.
No brainer. Let's convert into a product company. And it's crazy because we had really no idea what we were talking about. Like, we were clueless. You know,
I appreciate the honesty.
No, but I mean, pivoting is not as cool as it sounds. You know, is my real key message. But the thing that was amazing is that when we started the pivot, we did it basically at a moment when the service business was really peaking. And before we took the decision to pivot, we said, well, let's start and recruit some like software engineers, because those people are super rare. You know, like, do you know a software engineer, someone that's available for hire? You know, like, and everyone would start laughing and saying, these guys, you know, like they're super rare, they're super difficult to recruit. And it took us around 6 months to find the first 1 or 2 that said, well, you know what, you guys, you sound pretty crazy, but I think that what you're going to be launching is going to be fun, so let me join. And as soon as we started having that first group of 2-3 software engineers, then it was pretty fast to go from 2-3 to 5-6 to 10. And then that's when we said, look, we have an ability to attract software profiles. Let's start this pivot. It's going to take 6 months to, from an organizational point of view, from a technical point of view, go from a service company to a product company. And it's going to take us 1 year to pivot the clients commercially from a service business model to a product business model.
Yeah, because I can imagine that also. How did your sales team react to that message? Like, hey, you've been selling projects for years now. Now you're going to sell a product. What was their reaction?
I think, you know, like, there was both. There was resistance to change because people said, "Oh, it's going to be more difficult," and they were right.
Yeah.
But on the same side, since a lot of those people were also shareholders, they said, "Well, maybe, you know, like, this is worth the effort." You know, like. And if we manage to make that work within a year, then this is a really, really good deal. But once again, I think we entered that process because we didn't have the experience of what a real product company is, and because we didn't have the experience of pivoting one company from one to the other.
Yeah.
And it's because we didn't have that experience that we were crazy enough to do it. With hindsight, I think it's a decision that would be worth revisiting. You know, like, typically saying, well, Real Impact, it even sounds like a service company.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
It's got the name of a service company, and so that company was running.
Yeah.
We could have actually accepted that it have defocus, that it does any industry, you know, like, and that we just be yet another one of those players who does analytics instead of Deloitte or instead of Accenture.
And happy days, right?
And
making good money.
Happy days and good money. Yeah. And I think with hindsight, that would have been a company that would have let grow.
Yeah.
You know, like, and Reactor, would have benefited from being set up as a separate entity, like with a different payroll with investors, and that we basically go through the cycles of MVP, like first clients, then kind of finding the problem solution fit before you go seek the product market fit. And because we try to do both of those things at the same time, we created a huge amount of complexity, because those 6 months turned out to be 1 year to change the organization. And that 1 year to convert the clients turned out to be 3 years. And when you get these type of assumptions wrong, because you don't have the experience in doing these type of transformations, it just translates into a lot of costs, so a lot of money thrown out of the window, a lot of frustration because things are not moving fast enough. And at some point you doubt, are we going to get to destination or not?
Yeah, of course.
And people who read the Lean Startup say, oh, well, it's really cool to pivot. But actually when you talk to investors, not founders, when they hear you're in a pivot, they get very stressed. They say, well, why don't you come and see me after the pivot? And then once you've succeeded in your pivot, then I'm happy to discuss whether we would invest or not. But that other side of the table, what does it illustrate? It illustrates that actually pivots are generally fatal moments for young structures. And so people who read the Lean Startup think that it's incredibly cool to pivot and that they should do it because it's part of the learning cycle. Whereas what the book really says is that you should pivot whenever necessary, but know that it's a survival move. Know that you should not take those type of moves lightly. And when the investors give you that perspective to say, well, come and see me only once the pivot is finished, shows that we're actually one of the lucky few who managed to successfully pivot, put 90% of our clients into a recurring business model that is an app model. And in that process, go from a service company of 80 people that could do whatever the client wanted on any type of telecom need to basically a company that sells 2 products. There's one for emerging markets around sales and distribution optimization, and there's one for developed markets around capex optimization. And those are the 2 only things that we're going to be selling. That pivot was a real huge learning. I
guess also financially, because you were a bootstrapped company, right? So you always lived from your own profits, unless I'm mistaken. But then you decided to pivot, and then you needed to do that pivot on bootstrapped capital, and only then you could raise money from investors, right?
Yes. And so typically it's pretty amazing to say to yourself that you grow a company from nothing to 100 with basically operational cash flow. So that was a really fun process. And it was always stressful, right? The first day I sent an invoice for $1 million, I was like, whoa, this is another league. And by the way, when that $1 million is 1 month late, it's horrible because everything crashes. Everyone gets tense, and that invoice needs to be paid from Nigeria. And so go tell your banker, we're a bit late on payments, and it needs to come from Nigeria.
We're waiting for $1 million from a Nigerian prince. Yeah.
And you're gonna get the money, and we got paid from all sorts of crazy countries, but it's very, very tense. But that bootstrap dynamic, we basically managed to bring it to when we were around 100. And that's when we basically said, okay, well, now we have a runway. We have visibility at the point where we should basically change the funding strategy. And that's when we started to basically raise funds. We had been using leverage and debt from banks for a while already. And so it was really time to say, okay, well, we've been bootstrapping for a fair amount of time. Now this company needs different levels of funds in order to sustain its growth and finish the pivot. And that's basically when we went towards the venture capital.
Do you think you can do a product company without venture capital?
Yes, I'm convinced. I think the key point is people often have misconceptions around ownership and funding. And so the typical, let's say, young entrepreneur or first-time entrepreneur perspective is to say, well, if I create a product company, I need to raise funds. Okay, and so that's a fallacy. Actually, if you're a developer and you're able to create an MVP, you can have your early client base pay you a symbolic, like 100, 200, 500 euros per year, and that generates income. And if you're touching a really nicely scalable problem, well then 200 euros per year times 1,000 users. With that, you can already have 3, 4, maybe 5 developers fresh out of uni working for you. Okay, so this whole notion of saying, how can you very quickly confirm the value you create? How better a way to prove that than with getting a small amount of money paid back? And it's silly, but they're developers who created Winamp. They're developers who created very easy, softwares that are used by hundreds of people, video editing software, but that you only need to pay once 10 euros.
Yeah.
Well, those guys actually have confirmed the value of their product with a very easy price point. Yeah. And I always prefer people who generate value with a client paying than those who basically always say, oh, well, we're going to create a community and then one day we'll figure out the business model. The second fallacy in a first-time entrepreneur's thinking is, opening my capital is a bad thing. They often say, I need to bootstrap because I want to keep 100% of the company. And actually there's a real flaw, even economical flaw of, is it better to have 100% of something which is not funded to grow correctly? Yeah. Versus having 80% of something which is funded and that will probably double in size or will grow twice as fast as the one which is not correctly funded.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's really the dimension where I say it's not that important to have a high percentage of ownership. You can actually have lots of mechanisms to maintain your ownership. You can have warrant plans, you can have different voting classes. And so when people say, yeah, but I always want it to be my company, yeah, well, there are ways to do that. I want to have most of the upside in what I sell. Well, then, yeah, the best way to do that is to bring in revenue.
Yeah, absolutely.
The faster you bring in revenue, the faster you can have higher valuations, and then whatever funding you get dilutes you less.
Yeah.
But there's this misconception with the entrepreneurs that I need to keep everything and that I need to be bootstrapped.
I would guess. I guess I'm a little bit more of the second case where we're doing services, so we don't need to raise capital. But I would be concerned not about giving away equity per se or giving away value or about the money, but it's more about control. How was it for you? Like the moment you got VCs on board. Before that, I don't know. How was your life before, as a CEO, before you had venture capitalists, and how was your life after? Did it change dramatically, or?
So then, from VCs are not very different than all sorts of other types of partners that you can attract to the adventure you've created, and just VCs resellers, like implementation partners, like outsourcing partners, these are all companies that come in all shapes and sizes. And so there's some VCs that are humongous and that are only going to accept to put, majority stakes at very high valuations and to take you out. Just like you'll have very small VCs who will only want to put 1 million for a minority stake, and you need to be in the Benelux to basically be eligible.
Yeah.
And the reason why I'm mentioning partners rather than VCs is because undeniably, the most value is created when founders and their partners work hand in hand in the long-term interest of the company.
Yeah. That's an obvious one, but not always.
It's obvious, but people forget that.
Yeah.
They forget that, and then you hear all these market stories about this VC was a real pain for this entrepreneur, or vice versa, and you actually realize that because they come in all shapes and sizes, when you choose your partner, you need to make sure that you're very much aligned on how, what are you aspiring for. how are you going to manage good situations, and maybe how are you going to manage less good situations. And with hindsight, you know, like one of the things that I learned is we had a lot of hopes in the partnership between our investors and the founder group. And when we were confronted with difficult realities at Reactor, because we had our period of high growth and we had a period where we had a pretty big crisis. It was a crisis, by the way, just for the parenthesis, that was at one time we had our shitstorm, where in Brazil there was a political crisis, and so all of our revenue in Brazil disappeared. In Africa there was a foreign exchange crisis, so from one day to the next we cost 40% more, and so our sales went down by 40%. Fortunately in Europe we managed to create a business line from nothing, but you see, all of these things together meant that we delivered 10% growth instead of delivering 100% growth. And when you're sized to deliver 100% growth, that means you've been burning quite a lot of money. And so the reason why I was mentioning this crisis that Reactor went through is not only because we were able to survive, we were able to reorganize the company and make it an even much better company than what it was before. But when that happens with a partner that basically then starts saying, oh, well, our interests are not aligned, our way of managing the company is not aligned, well, that's going to potentially put the company on the floor. You know, like, and so the divergence that can appear between partners is extremely, extremely important. And that's a point that I'd invite other entrepreneurs to look at when they think about this. Whether you're in a service company or in a product company, I mean, in a service company, imagine that tomorrow you'd say, oh, well, Chris, you want another person to join that's going to be senior, that's going to have responsibility for recruitment, responsibility for client relationships. And that's a new partner you're bringing in. And imagine that guy turns out to be like a complete diva, or a very acid person, someone that actually destroys culture within Data-Minded. Well, that's just as bad as having an investor that basically diverges in the intention of or in his vision of what the long-term interest of the company is. And then that divergence, the organization needs to manage. And that can be very, very damaging.
So it's a matter of selecting your partners really well.
And you know, like today, obviously, I would select partners differently than how I did 2 years ago. But one of the things that I would do differently is, first, I would not work with a partner that has never done that before. Okay, so a first-time fund I would not do. I would go to a seasoned fund and I would ask to meet the entrepreneurs that were part of their first fund. Not the ones who did times 10, not the ones who did times 0, but those who did times 1.5. Because those will probably be the most interesting companies in portfolio to talk to, because they will be able to tell you how the fund behaves when basically you didn't go bankrupt. So we're not angry at you, we're not sour at you.
Yeah, they still care about you.
But you didn't do times 10, and so you were not at the level of the aspiration, and it's in that small multiple that you really see what's the real DNA and what's the real culture of a fund.
Oh, that's interesting.
If you meet an entrepreneur who says, well, I did 1.5 and I'll never work with those investors again, that's a pretty good signal to understand that fund is aggressive, dominant, like whatever qualificative you want to add.
Absolutely. Maybe to wrap up the Reactor part, can you share a bit about one of the products you mentioned was network capex? What is the value proposition there? Why, if I'm a telco here in Europe or in the US, why do I care about that product?
So in 1 second, it's pretty simple. If you're the CEO of a telco company, you're currently spending around 15% of your revenue in your network.
Okay, that's a lot.
It's hundreds of millions, like if not billions. So it's the biggest envelope in a telco's budget. So it's humongous. And when you ask a CEO, how do you allocate that budget? you often find that the answer is Excel.
Yeah, still?
It's still Excel. It's actually, and the reason why I'm shocked by that, it's because it's such a core process. It's such a strategic process that, you know, like it's really, you need to go at the heart of the telco to be able to talk about capex allocation. And because it's at the heart, this is a process that basically has not changed much in the last 10 years. It's been protected because the users are the same, the processes are very clear, and so the tools are still the same. But when you manage Excel, or when you use Excel to manage hundreds of millions in decisions, or billions in decisions of where you allocate your capex, you realize that you're missing out on a lot of things.
Yeah, of course.
I'm not just talking about data quality issues and, and formula mistakes, which are there, but I'm mostly talking about you don't get any algorithm value, you don't get any, you know, like big data value, you don't get any putting data together value, you know, like and all of that allowed us to demonstrate that we could increase the efficiency of your capex by anywhere between 5 and 15%.
Yeah.
And so if you say that you're spending 100 million in 5G and we're able for 90 to get better results, that's very significant.
Yeah, well, it's a very clear and easy business case, I guess. But how was it like? So I understand the financial numbers behind it. Then convincing telcos to get on board with that, how is that process like? I guess you can't sell this to the network engineer. You need C-level buy-in for these kind of tools, right? Or how does that work?
The reason why it's a difficult sell is not because it's an obvious business case. So that's really easy. Yeah. The reason why it's difficult is there are several reasons. The first is indeed it's a C-level decision. Yeah. So you need to basically get the users excited. Yeah. So that they basically go up to the C-level to say, we need this. Okay, and so that's a specific type of large enterprise sales, where you basically have a sandwich approach, where you start with the users, you get them excited, in parallel you go towards the top leadership, and then basically the top leadership will say, thank you, Monsieur Deletaille, let me contact my teams, and that message is the most important. Okay, if the teams go back to the C-level and say, yes, we know those guys, yes, they're good, yes, we'd like to explore the product, then you start a customer journey. And if you don't, then you basically continue this process, because there are few large enterprises in telco, right? Like there are around 20 big groups that you want to work with. Yeah. And so if one connection doesn't work, you just continue other connections until it works. And that's why it's long sales. Because typically, you know, like you can have anywhere between 3 and 4 sponsors, and you can have anywhere between 5 and 10 different departments that can start using your app. Yeah. Then the thing that you need to realize is when you do these large enterprise sales, clearly it's a different approach than, you know, like long tail, B2C, web. These are all completely different sales dynamics. And so we were all about stakeholder mapping. We were all about sequencing how we approach different people, and we were all about very quickly identifying a client sponsor and a client champion. Yeah. The sponsor had budget responsibility, the champion was the doer, the get shit done guy or girl that would basically run around a telco and say, this project is gonna happen. And when you had that combination, then your likelihood to sell would be more around 40-50%.
Oh, pretty cool. All right. So if you're going to wrap up the reactor chapter there, at some point you decided to, well, I've created this from zero, here we are, now I want to start again. Yeah. What was the story there?
So it was really a dual story. On one hand, you know, like I was in a conflict with my investors, and so pretty clearly, you know, like when you get into that type of conflict, it's very difficult to say, you know what, let's turn the page, let's move on. Not because either party is not willing, but just because it went very, very far. Mm-hmm. And so at the same time that I was basically in conflict with the investors, and we were saying, okay, well, we don't really see a path for convergence At the same time, I was getting approached by a whole set of health actors who wanted me to enter their boards. You know, like hospitals, you know, like insurances, and they basically came up to me to say, Seb, there's a real change in the industry. Data and digital is really top priority for the healthcare space in Belgium. You're one of the very seasoned and, you know, like renowned entrepreneurs in this space. Could you join our board? Because we'd love to have a young perspective on all of the things we're trying to do. And so those two things happened at the same time. And so when I submitted my resignation at Reactor, I said, okay, well, look, guys, the company is, you know, like sustainable. You know, like we have a successor which is in the company that could take up the CEO role, which is Wim Boremans. He's a great guy. You know, like trust him more than anyone. You know, like to take up the role of the CEO. The teams are loyal. They're going to continue to make it a great success. Since we're diverging, I'm gonna move on, and I'm gonna take the next 3 months or so on to explore what can be done in the healthcare space. And going back to roots is very fun, you know, like very, very fun, because you go back to the point where you have a white page. You go back to the point where you say, okay, well, with everything I learned with Reactor, how am I going to choose my market? You know, like, am I going to go to the state and try and convince them to give me a private contract to redo their entire platform in 10 years? Am I going to go to the ziekenfonds, mutualité? Am I going to go to the hospitals? Am I going to go to doctors? And so you see all of those questions, you have a blank page. And so I spent 4 months meeting around 500 people to understand the market, understand what was going on, what was exciting, what were experiments that worked, what were experiments that didn't work, and basically put all that exploration together and find something fun.
Well, there must be, it must, indeed, as you said, it must be different this time, because when you started Reactor from a blank page, you had a lot of things to learn, and you said a few times, in hindsight I would have done this and this differently, but here you had a ton of background already, like a ton of experience, but still it was a different sector, right? So how, according to you, is there a big difference between how to approach this in telco versus health, or doesn't really matter which industry you're in?
So I do think that there are quite some similarities in certain you know, like sales types, you know, like, and so if you're in service, you know, like you'll have a lot of similarity with another service company, even if they don't do engineering, but if they do, you know, like law, you'll have a lot of similar dynamics.
Absolutely.
And so on the same side here, I wanted it to be a tech company. So I turned the page on services. That's something I don't want to do anymore in life. So I wanted it to be a product, but a platform, a software, an app. These were all, you know, like possibilities. And if I had gone towards hospitals, it would have been similar to a telecom dynamic, in the sense that, you know, like, there's a big C-level, you know, like dynamic. There are a lot of politics, you know, like between the different actors in the hospital. There's a procurement process, you know, like which is, you know, like worse than telcos, because in this particular case, it follows the guidelines of, you know, like public markets. And but so if I had gone towards hospitals, it would have been similar to telcos. If I had gone towards doctors, then it's different from Reactor, because there I'm more speaking with a long tail. You know, like
there's a lot of doctors out there.
There are a lot of doctors, you know, like and so if I had basically worked with doctors, that would have been different. Because there you're much more in the dynamics about what you'd find with SaaS companies. With sales development reps, business development reps, reporting to an account executive, and there's a lot of cold calling. There's, you know, like a number of conversions that are expected each month, and then you have the customer success teams that are basically in charge of the renewals. And so the good news is that after all of this exploration, I've actually found a new company that I'm going to become the CEO of.
The CEO?
And
wow, congratulations.
It's a company that's called MIDI, And what they do is practice management software for doctors.
Yeah.
And if I talk to you about, like next time you go to your doctor, you'll see that he has a software on his computer. And when you come into the office, he types your name, Chris Peters, and his list of patients, and then he selects you. He has basically all the history of all the consultations you've had with him. Yeah. And then he's going to add a new consultation and say, okay, well, Chris, you have a headache. Okay, well, I'm going to prescribe this. And then I'm going to directly sync this consultation with the eHealth platform at the state level. And so that software, which does something that every doctor needs to deliver, every doctor provides consultations. It's a very, I wouldn't say boring software, but it's a pretty normal software.
Yeah, it's very operational. It's
very operational.
Exciting. It's just enter information, log the information.
Voila, and it's moving away from paper and going towards digital.
Yeah.
And so if it was just that, maybe it wouldn't be a very exciting opportunity for me. The reason why I find it very exciting is because MIDI Spring is a cooperative of doctors. And so it's 1,000 GPs, generalists across Belgium that had said, well, we want to create our own software. And so 1,000 in Belgium, that's 10%.
Yeah.
So 10% of the GPs in Belgium said, let me create a cooperative where we're going to be the shareholders and the users.
Yeah. And why did they do that? Because there must be other software out there as well, right?
So the market has been there for nearly 40 years. Okay, so there have been lots of softwares. There have been a lot of softwares that have been bought by different players, and so you'd basically consider that there are three bigger players. Okay. And we're the fourth entrant. All right. The reason why they decided to create a cooperative is because the software they used to use got bought. Yeah. And so they were confronted with an opportunity, which was to say, well, do we just migrate to the other software of the company that bought us, or do we create the cooperative? And so that was the trigger. Okay. With that trigger, we basically have a huge community of users. We basically have people that are giving feedback to the software every day. Yeah. And so that feedback loop for continuous improvement is there. And then imagine that this dynamic with 10% of the GPs in Belgium, if it becomes viral, and if we go from 10% to 20, 30, 40% of GPs, then we're not a software anymore. Then we become a platform. Yeah. You see, because there's so much consultations, there's so much information which is created through our software, that basically at that point, you can ask yourself all of the fancy questions on why isn't Belgium the capital for healthcare, digital healthcare in Europe? Yeah. And so that's what I'm excited by. It's to say, well, with an initiative driven by GPs who are in charge of the data encoding, if we get sufficient mass, then we can really participate in the healthcare transformation for the entire country. Yeah. And I think that's cool.
Well, super exciting. Wow. Well, congratulations. So have you already started, or when is this?
So I started end of last year. They called me the night before Christmas. And they called me and they said, Seb, what are you doing tomorrow? I say, well, it's Christmas.
Having dinner with my family.
And so Seb, we have a few fires. Could you come over? And what I discovered is that they basically started to develop their own software in a period of like 5-6 months. That software had a bit of testing, but not a lot of testing.
Yeah, and it's not a lot of time to write medical software, right?
It's not a lot of time, and so what they managed to deliver in that time horizon with a whole set of partners is absolutely excellent. It's a real achievement. Yeah. But obviously, when you go into the next question, which is, okay, well, now you have the software, how are you going to migrate around 1,000 doctors, okay, from their old software with all of their data? You need to migrate that data into the new software. You need to basically you have one data model, which is different from the data model you're going to have. You're going to have people that will have hacked the data model, encoded things they were not supposed to encode in certain buckets. Yeah. And when you're going to import that into your new DB.
It's always a mess. It's always ugly.
It's gonna be ugly.
Yeah.
And the reason why they called me the night before Christmas is because they started migrating 1,000 doctors with a migration code that had never been tested. And so that's a recipe for failure, right? There's
Yes.
no tech professional that would say,
No.
good idea. No, it's
I've never seen a migration go right the first time. Never ever.
The thing is, they were so constrained on time because their old software would stop working on the 31st of January. Basically, what we did between the night before Christmas to basically the 31st of January was just work like crazy, weekends, nights.
Yeah.
That was a really, really intensive period. But the good news was we managed to migrate everyone. Everyone is very loyal to the cause and to the cooperative, and so we actually lost nearly no clients in this whole process.
Yeah.
And since basically the end of last month, we're in a dynamic where every 2 weeks we make a release where we continue to improve the software. And there are definitely lots of things the software could do better. Like it's a real, by definition, V1. But what I find tremendous is we're showing a new face to product management for doctors. Because we're really showing to them what it means to have a great product, what it means to have continuous development, what it means to basically say, you know what, on this foundation where there's no tech debt, where we're directly in the right frameworks, this is going to be very, very exciting for the next couple of years.
Because I guess they're used to yearly release cycles and very ugly software that nobody cared about the UI or the UX. And you're trying to give them an improved customer journey. Is that your approach? How are you going to differentiate from the three big monoliths that are out there?
So undeniably, there's some software, when you look at it, you wonder how they still function in 2019. Interfaces that come from the 80s Microsoft Access lookalikes. And I mean ugly, really, really bad.
And there's still people paying every month to use that Access-like software.
Yeah. Real nightmares. And the reason why doctors have not had the reflex to seek better products or to switch is doctors generally don't like technology. They associate it with administrative burden.
The few doctors I know, definitely they hate technology. They just want it to work and leave them alone.
Exactly. And that's the next thing is when it doesn't work, the reflex is scream at the IT guy.
Yes.
And so for those reasons, the relationship between doctors and the potential of technology has not been very good, especially when you look at the interfaces they have. It's complicated. Yeah. You need to think like crazy to say, well, what am I supposed to do next?
Yeah.
Usability, customer experience, or just even basic design are things that they have never experienced. They've just had this crappy software for years. And so that combined with the fact that migrating is a very painful experience because you sometimes lose a bit of data. Maybe some of the data goes into the wrong space. Things that you were able to do with your old software, you're not able to do with the new one. And so all of these elements of change also explain why it's a market that has not had much switching or much churn. But the reason why I'm hopeful that this dynamic will be different is because we're going to be able to show what it means to have a real tech company, which is owned by doctors but managed by professional tech guys
who've been there, who've done that,
who know what who know what QA means. In migration code, we know what that means. We know how to deliver that. But and so that's one element, which is let's compete on features. I was at the MIT Innovators Under 35 Europe in November, and I saw innovations there that we need to put into the software. Mind-boggling stuff. And too early to tell, but that's one angle. Let's make a great product. Let's really bring it up to cutting-edge innovation as the type of innovations you see at MIT. But then you also can compete on values. Because the reason why this initiative is really fundamentally different it's not the feature set. You know, like it's actually the value set. It's saying, do you want to be part of this movement, of this community of doctors who are basically bringing the change to the Belgian dynamic?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, like and this is led by doctors.
Yeah.
These are doctors that are deciding what makes sense for them.
Not some big corporate in France or whatever.
VC led or whatever. You know, like and that for me is I'm very hopeful about that.
They almost sound communist here.
Look, I mean, some people might draw parallels from, you know, like my experience at Reactor, going from a, let's say, VC funded, you know, like high growth, you know, like tech startup, you know, like which is kind of the traditional path towards becoming the tech CEO of a cooperative. That I'm not a founder. You know, like I'm joining it very early on, but I'm technically not a founder. And a cooperative, which means that there will never be exit value. You know, like and so here I'm not sacrificing the high growth dimension. I'm not sacrificing the desire to have an amazing product. Those things I have in common with both, but clearly I'm going to be testing a different governance model, and I'm pretty curious to see whether creating tech companies through cooperatives might become a bigger trend.
Yes, I've never even thought of that, because when you compared VCs to partners, well, now you have 1,000 partners, right? You have 1,000 partners that all have their own wishes and desires, and it's not going to be the easiest governance model, I guess.
I think, you know, like it's one of the things I learned well of governance is, you know, like if you manage expectations well, it's already a big part of the battle. You know, like if at some point people expect you to do ×2 and then you do plus 10%, it's an expectation problem. You know, like then here, if you promise that your software is going to do everything for every user in 6 months, you're really bad at expectations. If you tell them, look, we're not going to be able to satisfy everyone's needs, but let us explain to you how we're going to satisfy as many people as possible. Let us explain to you how we're going to listen to your needs and maybe reshape them a bit. Let us explain to you how our highest priority is to make you very happy doctors. I'm pretty confident that type of expectation will lead to, you know, like much happier users, promoters, and you know, like all of the dynamics that are associated.
But even one step further, as a patient, I sometimes see my doctor like spending way too much time on his machine or his computer. It's like, you should be here for me. Like, I'm a patient in need now. Listen to me, take care of me, and don't worry about your computer, right? So if you succeed in making it as easy as possible for the doctors to interface with your solution, the doctors will spend more time with their patients. That's in the end, I guess, what they care about most, right?
And that's typically the whole dimension where, like, we can go further than free text boxes. We can go further than, you know, like encoding everything. You know, like there's amazing work that's taking place around speech to text, automated classification, natural language processing. You know, like and so there's some cool things that are happening. It's just that for the moment they're not happening in Belgium, and I would love that change, and that we actually really demonstrate that, you know, like Belgium is a capital in Europe for biotech. It's a capital for big pharma. Or why not we make it a capital for digital health? You know, like I'm delighted that London is making great investments and making it happen. I'm delighted that Copenhagen, you know, like or Estonia, be other cities and countries that do the same.
It should be here.
But it should be Belgium. You know,
well, I know the city of Leuven is actively promoting health as well. They try to grow that community of health and tech as much as they can as well.
And it also means, because in Leuven you basically have the UZ Leuven, who's the university hospital that's doing a lot of custom build. You see, and so here the whole dynamic is going to be, how can we make sure that we create champions that have European potential? rather than local initiatives that basically lock up a city.
Yeah.
Which is a different way of looking at it, but
Yeah.
I've done both at RIA. I did custom IT and I did products. And with custom IT, you have high tailor the work, you have high matching with the local needs, but you don't have anything that's scalable. And,
no, that's true.
And that's really what I think we need to set up, is that ecosystem of healthcare, digital healthcare champions that have the ambition to kind of conquer Europe.
Cool. So you also have the ambition to conquer Europe?
Sure. We're going to start with Belgium because basically this is where we have our community of users.
Yeah.
And I think from Belgium you have a very easy kickoff ground to go to a whole set of other countries.
Wow.
But I think if we're able to prove that our formula works, that a community-led tech initiative is able to grow and be successful and have even better standards than some of the softwares that are on the market, well then let's do this.
Super exciting. Wow. Well, so maybe that brings us to our next topic is how do you see, in broad terms, the future of data? You've been in this space ever since you created your first Excel model at McKinsey, I guess, or ever since you were an assistant of physics. So you've seen quite a lot of trends in two industries now, telco and health. Where do you see data evolving? How do you see data evolving in the next 5 to 10 years?
I'm going to give a pretty boring answer. I think I think we're going to pretty much be in the continuation of a lot of the trends that are already there. And so, for example, there's a whole trend around better data quality, automated cleaning, automated integration.
But it's not sexy. I mean, I like it, but it's not sexy.
It's not sexy, but I think that's just going to continue to take a lot of room, and it's just going to become those problems are going to become smaller and smaller. Because it's crazy. The other day I was just cleaning up my contact database, and the amount of tools that will automatically fill in areas, automatically recognize first names, last names, test phones, eliminate numbers that are good or not good. These are problems that we would spend hours and man days to create code to do. And so there's a huge trend around just going as far as you can on automating that data quality. I think there's the huge trend around that was started with data visualization, Tableau, Click, that's going to continue around this mass commoditization. It's incredible, but even Google with G Sheet is actually contributing tremendously to the diffusion of data for all. And so that I'm pretty sure is going to continue to occur.
Okay.
And it's not going to be driven by SaaS, by IBM, or by the big companies that had certification programs. It's going to be driven by Python, or a whole set of other softwares that can be readily available.
And open source.
And open sourced. The other trend which I find very exciting is, and it's going to be at the expense of a lot of the data scientists, or rather data analysts, is that there's going to be a huge movement towards automation. On saying, there are a whole set of analyses that we know that need to be produced, no brainer, and I understand what type of field is in the database, and so when that field is there, this is what people generally like to do. We were already on that trend 5 years ago. We called it guided analytics. We would produce tags to identify certain types of patterns in all sorts of distributions. Companies like TrendMiner would do the same thing, not in telco but in industrial sectors, but it's the same thing. So that trend is going to continue to take place. So you're going to see a huge traction around automation. And then the last two trends that I find exciting is you're going to have it's not a ping pong, but it's more like an equilibrium, a balancing mechanism that's going to take place around privacy and GDPR. Okay, and so for the moment, like a regulation has gone very much in one side. You're going to see that there's going to be the pendulum's going to go in the other direction, where like other elements of respecting privacy are going to appear, new types of algorithms, having the possibility to extract a pattern without compromising privacy. For me, is going to be a huge trend for the future of data. And we're going to be. And then the last trend or the last hope I have is that we're going to be breaking the monopolies of a very educated AI. For the moment, companies like Google have always been smart around acquiring data. They've been the smartest of making sure that every initiative that they launched would be launched in the direction of acquiring extra data. And so when they have cars that scan streets that populate Google Maps, it creates huge value for everyone. The side effect is they've created a huge database of a whole set of things. When you look at Google Pictures that they've used to train their vision algorithms, when you look at scanning old books in order actually not only to have a history of characters and a history of literature, they've also had the same book translated by professional translators in lots of different languages. And so when you get a book like The Little Prince translated in 50 different languages, all of those relationships can be fed into an AI to improve your translation capabilities. And so the reason why I'm talking about this is because we both know that in the field of data, if you have a lot of data, you do get a competitive edge.
Absolutely.
That your competition is going to have a very hard time recreating because of that huge cost of putting that data together. I really do think that there's going to be a huge shift in the market around are we going to have public and open source data? Okay. And that when data reaches a certain mass, does it continue to belong to a private individual or a company, or does it then start to belong to other parties? And that trend for me is very exciting. It's more the revolutionary trend where you basically say, okay, well, data is going to continue to professionalize, it's going to continue to be seamless, it's going to continue to be invisible. But on this front, are we going to break the AI monopolies? Because here, that trend is phenomenal. It's going to change everything we do. And so do we really want that to belong to a limited number of companies?
All of them American at the moment.
All of them, or Chinese?
Oh, absolutely. Indeed, we here in Europe, we don't have a lot of counterweight against those big companies at the moment, right?
We don't, and it's really it's a mix of we're not competing with the same funds. At some point, how much is Google paying for their top AI scientists? We're in tens of millions of dollars per year. It's at some point where CEOs of publicly traded companies are paid less than the lead AI engineer in these type of companies. And obviously that market value is driven by demand and by the fact that they're super, super rare. But so in Europe, which company could put 20 million to recruit one guy?
It creates a brain drain, right?
It creates a brain drain. And so for me, the only way that we help European champions to emerge is by changing the rules of the game. And so you can change the rules of the game when you think about ownership of data. That is one way to trigger a change in the balance and a change in the leverage. And so it's really, if you put the leverage here, then you'll be able to move the whole finger. Whereas if you put the leverage there, you're going to have a hard time moving the whole finger. And so it's really a question of what's your point of leverage. Ownership of data is one dimension. And then there's this next dimension, which is, well, if you create this disruption, call Europeans that are abroad, because there are lots of Europeans that are in China or in the US, say, hey, now's the time that we really make a difference here.
Yeah.
And there is this trend of successful entrepreneurs that want to come back home and say, I've ticked the box of being a millionaire. And so now I can really just do this for the shits and giggles, and let's make this fun. For the moment, there's some exciting things happening in the Nordics. In Finland, Sweden, you see a lot of ex-US entrepreneurs that are coming back home.
I didn't know that.
And so now it's just that we need to continue that trend and make it stronger.
Wow, cool. One final question. You shared quite a few lessons learned already, but looking back, are there other things you would say from all your experience you had, both working at McKinsey and starting your own company, creating it up until a point where it was a big scale up, and then restarting all over again, now joining a health company? What are some of the biggest lessons learned? What are some of the things that you would do differently now?
So there are a million things, but I think the 2 points that I had already covered during this discussion is one, don't think pivots are easy, okay? And if you do decide to pivot, find people who have done it before and who will bring their experience into your pivot.
Yep.
If you just go it, blindsided, running in the dark, it's likely you're going to hit the wall. The second piece of advice that I gave is be careful when you choose your partners, and these partners can be who you've found the company with, it can be who you raise money with, it can be who you actually go in sales with, etc., etc. Yep. But those things are things that you really need to consider are very difficult to change once they've done. You're done, and the good way to analyze your partners is to talk to their references. Not the ones who were superstars, not the ones who were super failures, but the guys in the middle. Yeah. They're the guys that are going to tell you the most about how your partner is going to behave when things don't follow the plan. The last dimension, or maybe the last goodie or lesson learned that I can share is the meaning of the word focus has never stopped changing for me. And it's always gone to more focus. Yeah. And the analogy I like to use is to say, when you look at the size of the sun compared to the size of planet Earth, planet Earth is focus compared to the sun. And you can go in the other direction, and what are the bigger and bigger stars? And then the sun is focus versus the largest stars in the universe. Yeah. But every time that I thought I was focused, I say, now I'm focused. Look, I'm planet Earth. Yeah. And then I realized, well, on planet Earth, well, then I can be Belgium. Now I'm focused and I'm Belgium, and that's focus. And then you realize that within Belgium, you can continue to go down. Yeah. And so the reason why I use this analogy is because the number of times where I could have signed a contract or bet you €1,000 that I'm a super focused company, and I was wrong, I stopped counting them. The number of times I could have said, no, that's a different persona, we are not able to address the needs of that persona. Yeah. Or no, that's a feature request that opens up this type of complexity into the software. We might want that in the future, we don't want that today. And the number of dimensions that I brought into products way too early, when you want your app to be compatible in several languages, then directly everything in your front end needs to be translated into every language you add. People underestimate it. They underestimate the amount of effort. That doesn't mean you should only be monolanguage, but it's just, when do you want to introduce that? Yeah. Because the amount of work that you're adding in QA, you need you need dummy data sets in all the other languages to be able to show that the app delivers what it needs in every different language. You then need to have QA profiles that are able to see the differences in the different languages. That means that every time you're going to make a release, you're going to have translators that are going to be working on adding all of that. And the reason why I'm using the example of language is because it's understandable by everyone, but there are lots of other dimensions where I said, okay, well, do we have a mobile app for our users? Yes or no? Is that mobile app on-premise or in the cloud? How am I going to manage the sync when there's bad connectivity? All of these questions created tremendous complexity down the road. And when we started them, we said, oh, it's easy. We're just going to use Microsoft Azure. We're going to be cloud-based. This is how we're going to sync the exchange of data with the on-premise servers. And then you realize 1-2 years down the road that those decisions were some of the most costly you've introduced. Because you lacked focus, and often because you lacked some form of understanding of the architecture choices that you were introducing.
All right, cool. Well, thanks very much for the conversation. It's always an honor and a pleasure to talk to you. And I wish you best of luck with your new startup / scale up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Nice talking to you.